From Michigan Public, this is It's Just Politics. I'm Zoe Clark.
And I'm Rick Pluta.
The race for Michigan governor is starting to heat up publicly, with forums being held and debates actually being scheduled.
We're seeing more poll numbers being released.
Here to take a temperature check on all things the race for governor are Simon Schuster, politics reporter at Bridge, Michigan, and Jonathan Osting, deputy politics editor at Bridge, Michigan. Hey, you guys.
Hey, Zoe.
So first, what has changed? It feels like all of the sudden, all of the candidates are getting out in front of voters in a way that wasn't necessarily happening in the beginning of the campaign. Maybe I just mean on the Republican side, maybe I just mean John James. But seriously, Simon, what's going on here?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things. One is that, yes, John James is beginning to attend some of these forum panel events. I think it's to the chagrin of some of his Republican opponents and some local grassroots groups, particularly the Oakland County Republican Party, that John James hasn't appeared at some of these debates and forums where multiple candidates are sort of sharing their views because, you know, he was sort of the ostensible frontrunner and he hasn't wanted to sort of get, you know, descend into the fray if possible. But now he did. He attended a forum over the weekend for a Christian homeschooling convention talking about education issues before like a really friendly audience. This is sort of one of the tent poles of his campaign, is talking about parental freedom, giving them more oversight over their children's education. At the same time, too, on the other side of the race, there was a forum with the United Auto Workers on Monday when independent candidate Mike Duggan and also Democrat Jocelyn Benson, along with Genesee County Sheriff Chris Swanson, were there. And things got a little bit ugly between Jocelyn Benson and Mike Duggan. We're seeing some actual conflict happening in this race at a relatively early stage.
Jonathan, what do you make of the fact that these public appearances are happening now?
Well, I mean, for James, his campaign has always said sort of once the field is set, he would start doing more of these events. Technically, the field is not completely set because the Board of State Canvassers has not yet certified nominating petitions. But, you know, we've seen some polling that suggests James is no longer the obvious, you know, super clear-cut front runner. So perhaps he has a little more impetus to get out there. Now, notably, this homeschooling forum that he was at over the weekend, Perry Johnson was not there. Perry Johnson has been showing up to lots of events and complaining that John James wasn't there. So we still haven't seen the two of them share a stage or, you know, at least an event back-to-back, which could be quite interesting. Certainly no love lost there. We've got, you know, Perry Johnson suing John James and winning over this campaign logo issue. So things are getting pretty testy between those two, but we haven't actually seen them in a public setting as of yet.
Simon, so now that they are making these somewhat public appearances, let's start with the Republican side. What are they talking about?
Yeah, well, I mean, at this Christian homeschooling forum, things were pretty focused. This was a discussion about education, educational rights, and sort of the culture wars issues that have dominated Republican politics, particularly in the 2022 cycle, talking about, you know, promoting school choice, ensuring that, you know, what they consider to be, as Senate Minority Leader Eric Nesbitt called woke trans nonsense, is not in our schools. There's also the Educational Freedom Tax Credit. This is a program that would allow people to, individual taxpayers, to donate up to $1,800 a year to scholarship granting organizations. Public school advocates have called this a school voucher scheme that would fund private schools, diverting taxpayer money from public institutions. And they've really sort of promoted full-throated support for this. This is something that Governor Gretchen Whitmer hasn't yet taken a stance on. She's still studying it, whereas Democratic candidates such as Jocelyn Benson has said they're never going to go for this, no way.
And of course, there would also be a constitutional question there, a state constitutional question.
That's right. Yes. In Michigan's constitution, there is a ban on what they call parochiate. And so this is a difficult question as to whether this federal law could essentially overwrite some of these state instructions.
So, Jonathan, what are you hearing from the Republican candidates that's noteworthy?
Well, I mean, as Simon said, we've heard a lot of stuff on education recently. We're also hearing, continued attacks on Jocelyn Benson and specifically her ability to oversee the election fairly and accurately. She did put out a firewall policy the other week, sort of detailing how she'll separate her office functions from her candidacy. But that hasn't quelled some of those complaints. But for the most part, we're sort of hearing the status quo from Republicans, what we've been hearing for a while now, the same issues. And honestly, like at this homeschooling conference, not a ton of separation between the candidates either. There's some personality disputes and certainly a few sort of wedge issues that keep popping up. For instance, John James voting for what Perry Johnson calls the kill switch for automakers and in vehicles. That's a recurring theme that the Perry Johnson campaign is trying to make an issue in the primary, but it's not a huge one. There's not a lot of daylight on a lot of the policy issues.
Yeah, I think a good example of this is how Perry Johnson has sort of made eliminating Michigan's income tax the centerpiece of his campaign. He's been running heavily on this 47-47, impossible to miss. Those statings are a little bit overstated, those savings, but soon after, he came out and started heavily promoting this, all the other candidates were quick to note, hey, I'm also going to eliminate the income tax as well. So ensuring that there is not sort of one central issue that can separate these candidates.
Not necessarily separating these candidates, but of course they are going to need to separate from each other in order to get votes from primary voters. What is going to do that? Is it going to be fundraising, endorsements, name ID? How eventually are they going to figure out how to get to voters? Jonathan?
Well, as with many races, I think everybody is still wondering and waiting to see whether President Donald Trump will endorse in this race. We saw just this week evidence of his continued strength in the Republican Party in primaries, with Thomas Massie of Kentucky being ousted in a primary because he had, angered Trump by standing up to him on the Epstein files and other issues. So obviously that would be huge. Beyond that, I mean, we're seeing a lot of this campaign. Yes, there are public forums, but a lot of this campaign is going to be playing out on television. Perry Johnson, of course, is flooding the airwaves. Mike Cox announced a $1 million ad buy this week. John James's super PAC has been running ads and even updating them with a new logo after a preliminary injunction in the lawsuit Perry Johnson filed against him. We, of course, as journalists, try and cut through that noise and get at the actual issues at play. But a lot of these campaigns, are going to be primarily the way campaigns are interacting with voters is in these television ads, and there's going to be a ton of them.
Yeah, and I think to that note, to Jonathan's note, that there is some difference in messaging, particularly between John James and Perry Johnson. John James is really sort of sticking on some of these social and cultural issues, talking about education and healthcare. Whereas what we've seen from Perry Johnson just far is a singular focus on the economic issues. He's talked about his income tax cut and his promised mega audit of state government. He points to the fact that he's largely self-funding his campaign as an example that he can't be sort of bought by special interests, and that what he's interested in more than anything is putting more money back in your pocket. So there is some tension, within the Republican primary field as to their positioning, even if their actual policy platforms aren't all that different.
That's Simon Schuster, and he's joined by Jonathan Osting, both from Bridge, Michigan.
So, Simon, you're the money guy. How expensive is this race going to get?
It's going to get extraordinarily expensive. I think that we've seen an unprecedented amount of advertising spending. While Bridge doesn't have access to some of the very expensive ad tracking services that other firms do, we have seen internal numbers from certain campaigns and sort of some of these ad tracking services summaries. And we've seen that there's about $25 million in advertising spent on broadcast already among these gubernatorial candidates. That includes, more than $10 million from Perry Johnson, and an even larger amount from a 501c4, a dark money organization, a nonprofit group called Put Progress First that's supporting independent candidate Mike Duggan. It's been spending an enormous amount of money as well on advertising. And so while, we're seeing these historically expensive elections over and over again, 2022 was Michigan's most expensive gubernatorial election in history. I think that we're well on a trajectory to beat that record again.
Okay, well, let's turn to the Democratic side, a much smaller race for governor for this primary. What are the two candidates messaging right now, Jonathan?
Well, Jocelyn Benson, is kind of the clear front runner, is trying to, roll out policy proposals, affordability proposals. She had a proposal the other week about energy costs that was a little vague, but she's at least trying to run kind of a issue focused campaign. And you have that luxury when you're A, far ahead in the polls, and B, running against a candidate who isn't openly attacking you. Chris Swanson, the Genesee County Sheriff, is running a intentionally positive campaign. I mean, that's his main message is I'm a positive guy. I inspire people. I rally people. I mean, yes, he has policy positions. I think most notably, he's made a lot of hay about repealing the new wholesale tax on marijuana, for instance, and has gotten some traction with that proposal. But really, he's trying to share a positive vision for the state, which, is winning over crowds that he gets before. We saw, of course, I know you talked about it on your show the other week, the MEA has not endorsed because some of the local MEA chapters that Chris Swanson spoke before liked him and they backed him. So, when he does manage to get in front of a room, he generally does pretty well. He just doesn't have a ton of resources right now to get that message on TV like, Perry Johnson and Mike Duggan are doing. So, that gives Benson a little bit of a friendly path, perhaps. Obviously, he is inspiring people, but he's not attacking her. So she is facing criticism from Republicans, but it's, if it's a forum with Chris Swanson, she's not going to take a lot of heat publicly.
Simon, how much of the talk in the Democratic primary is about continuity with Governor Gretchen Whitmer versus taking a new direction?
No, I would say actually shockingly little right now. I think, we've seen in prior election cycles, people definitely talk about a passing of the baton, carrying the torch forward, to use more Olympic metaphors here, between two administrations. But I think Democrats are feeling a little bit weird about Governor Gretchen Whitmer right now. And that's in large part because, the fact that she's tried to have this working, productive relationship with President Donald Trump. He's going to be at the center of this midterm election. And I think that's Democrats are leaning on motivation to vote against President Trump's agenda as something that's going to bring their base out. And so, I don't know how productive that messaging is if you're sort of placing Governor Whitmer at the centerpiece. She's talked consistently about how she needs to sort of do what's best for the people of Michigan and is going to work with anybody to get things done. This has sort of been her message from day one as governor, something she's carried through. But I don't know how sort of potent that is in an election season, especially with an unpopular president in the White House and sort of, talking about this central Republican figure as something that's going to hinge this upcoming election.
And Jonathan, we have to bring independent candidate Mike Duggan into this. Where does he stand in the mix?
Well, there's some interesting polling that came out the other week suggesting he is starting to perhaps draw more from Republican candidates than he is from Democrats, even though he is a former Democrat himself. Jocelyn Benson was leading a recent three-way poll. A couple of recent three-way polls involving Mike Duggan and either John James or Perry Johnson. And that was good news for her. It looks like, Benson is starting to bring home some of the Democratic base that might have been on the fence in the race. And Republicans aren't necessarily doing the same as of yet. So Duggan, obviously he's running as a pragmatist, a problem solver, somebody who, got stuff done in Detroit, made reforms and helped that city's turnaround. But, the polling suggests that although he was faring pretty well early, that maybe that message is not resonating quite as much as it was early on. I mean, as Simon mentioned, we've got a really, obviously President Donald Trump, the polls suggest he is very unpopular right now, or has a lot of voters have a lot of unfavorable opinions about him. So this, mood that Mike Duggan was trying to capture, voters being sort of upset with both parties, might be tilting in the other direction, that voters are a little more upset with the party in the White House right now. I mean, we've got this, of course, unique dynamics this year. Michigan almost always, after 8 years of a governor of one party, switches parties. But also in midterms, traditionally the party in power does, the White House does poorly. So we've got opposing forces. And so far, it looks like, with high gas prices, with the ongoing war in Iran, that things are looking fairly positive right now for Democrats, but a long ways to go before November.
Yeah, Simon, to Jonathan's point, I mean, so many of these elections, whether it's U.S. Senate, whether it's this gubernatorial race, are being nationalized. How do you think national issues are going to play into the race on the ground here in Michigan?
Yeah, I think the beauty of the gubernatorial election is that it is a statewide election, right? This is not something that's going to decide the fate of the balance of Congress, where you've seen, I think, an extreme amount of nationalization in the Democratic primary for U.S. Senate between Haley Stevens, Mallory McMorrow, and Abdullah Sayed. Though that is a race that has been wholly absorbed by the national political environment, whereas I think we're seeing a bit more, Michigan-centric focus in this gubernatorial race. But to Jonathan's point, Mike Duggan, he's running on his reputation as, someone who sort of aided and shepherded Detroit's resurgence. He spent a lot of time outstate. And he certainly promoted himself in a prior iteration of this poll, which was, we should note, sponsored by the Detroit Regional Chamber, who has endorsed Duggan for governor, showed him neck and neck, almost slightly leading these candidates earlier in February. But this April poll shows him outside the margin of error. Jocelyn Benson is leading. She's got 34% of the vote in a three-way matchup between herself and John James. So it's a good sign for Benson. But at the same time, Duggan, he spent a lot of time outstate, up north, and he's realized, he sort of acknowledged in a call with reporters last week, that he needs to come home a bit. He needs to go back to Metro Detroit and try to win over these Southeast Michigan voters who he and his campaign are wagering are persuadable in this general election, that he can bring them over with a nonpartisan or at least centrist message that sort of eschews these traditional partisan sort of alignments. But that's going to be, I think, a really difficult ask, especially when we're in such a hyper-partisan environment that, Washington is so divided between parties right now. Midterm elections are often a referendum on the president in office, and Democrats certainly hope to make it one. And that's going to make, I think, Mike Duggan's job that much more difficult.
Meantime, many of the candidates running for governor are going to be headed up to the Mackinac Policy Conference next week. We will be there, Simon. I know you will be there watching what the candidates have to say up on the island. That is Simon Schuster, politics reporter at Bridge, Michigan, and Jonathan Osting, politics deputy editor at Bridge, Michigan. Thanks so much for filling us in.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks as always.
And that is It's Just Politics for today. I'm Zoe Clark.
And I'm Rick Pluta.
Let's talk again next week.